Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring you today's most pressing issues from across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. As the war in Gaza entered a ceasefire, the world is keeping close tabs on how the three-year-old war between Russia and Ukraine will unfold, especially with new leadership in the United States. U.S. President Donald Trump on Friday said that his administration has already had various serious discussions with Russian officials about the war and that he and Russian President Vladimir Putin could soon take significant action toward ending the conflict. Putin echoed Trump's assertions that the crisis could have been avoided if he remained in office, indicating his willingness to engage in dialogue. NATO's ongoing support for Ukraine and talks of potential peace negotiations are also ongoing as the world struggles to find a path to end the war. For more on this, we invite Pan Gil-chu, assistant professor at the Korean National Diplomatic Academy, with us. Welcome, Professor.
Hello, good to be with you.
And also joining us online is Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
So let's start with Dr. Davis. Trump has suggested that the U.S. is engaging in very serious discussions with Russia regarding the war. What are the possible implications of such talks, and how could they impact future diplomatic efforts in the region?
Well, clearly Trump has not managed to end the war in a single day, which was his claim as he was running for re-election. So he's now president. He's now engaged in discussions through his intermediaries, Keith Kellogg, with the Russians. And I think that basically what Trump is trying to do is to find a formula that basically brings the war to an end in a manner that does not leave him looking weak, that does not leave him essentially being seen to give in to Moscow. But at the same time, he's determined not to be drawn into an extended support of Ukraine, as was the case with the Biden administration. And I think that the risk is that that formula will not be found, and Trump will then be faced with the choice of either ramping up support for Ukraine, which is probably what he should be doing, in order to give Ukraine some chance of winning the war, or essentially the riskier option is that essentially he turns away, maybe does a deal with Russia that abandons Ukraine. That sends a terrible signal and a precedent for the future. So he's trying to find a path forward. I'm not sure that he'll succeed. And the key thing here to remember is that from Putin's perspective, he's under no pressure to find a ceasefire. Because he's slowly winning this war on the battleground.
Then what about Professor Ban? How do you assess the potential benefits and also risks of direct U.S. Russia negotiations?
Well, we need to differentiate between short-term benefits and long-term gains. In this regard, I would say that if the United States will attempt to make negotiations directly with Russia without sufficiently hearing from Ukraine, risks would be greater than benefits. To start with, when it comes to the potential benefits, since these direct negotiations aimed at terminating the long-lasting war on the Eurasian battlefield, the level of military confrontation might become lower than now. In particular, in a situation where Trump threatens to impose additional sanctions to Russia as part of the maximized pressure, a temporary ceasefire might be feasible, similar to the one in Israel and Hamas. However, these potential benefits are based on short-term gains. Accordingly, in terms of the potential risks, first of all, the fact that Trump directly meets Putin could send a misguided signal to the international community that Russia is now back to a normal state diplomatically. This signal is bad for preserving a rules-based order in the world because it could mean that an aggressor is not punished in the right way. Second, these direct negotiations could have a negative impact on how to end the war in the right way. If Trump embraces Putin's request that the war should be finished at the current front line or fighting line, geopolitical risks will be greater later on. In fact, there is little possibility that Putin pulls his forces back to the border line before the war. With this insight in mind, if this result happens indeed, a fundamental principle of sovereignty will be broken significantly. Finally, the League of like-minded countries will be weaker because this dialogue, these direct negotiations are underway in a situation where Trump bashes his allies like Canada through tariffs. To make a long story short, these direct negotiations appear to be based on short-term benefits away from long-term gains or long-lasting geopolitical stability.
Right. The discussions just between the two parties without Ukraine could be very swifted in one side. Now, the war in Ukraine is going for its third year now. At this current point, now, Dr. Davis, what kind of role do you think the U.S. can actually realistically play in ending the conflict, and how might this evolve under the Trump administration?
Well, look, what they should be doing is supporting Ukraine to enable Ukraine to force the Russians back out of their territory, including out of Crimea, and bringing about a decisive Ukrainian victory, and then opening Ukraine up to full NATO membership. That would be the best solution, the fairest solution, and the most just solution. I think that where you are likely to see the Trump administration go is pressuring Ukraine to bring about some sort of temporary ceasefire that gives Trump a face-saving solution that he can claim a win. At the same time, Trump has made it very clear that he wants access to Ukraine's rare earth materials as essentially a quid pro quo for continuing any support for Ukraine militarily. And I think that the key thing to remember once again is how Putin sees all of this. If Putin sees Trump willing to sign a deal with Russia that essentially disadvantages Ukraine and advantages Russia and basically rewards Russian aggression, all that's going to do is embolden Russia to essentially rebuild and regroup its forces during any ceasefire and then launch the war again in a year or two to take more territory. Because Putin has made it very clear that he doesn't necessarily want peace. What he wants is to create a new sphere of influence in Central and Eastern Europe and to dictate the terms of NATO's capitulation within that sphere. And I think that Putin believes that he can outlast the Ukrainians, and he can outlast the West, and he can essentially exploit Trump's willingness to do a deal to achieve his longer-term strategic aim. So I think the professor is right. Trump is thinking short-term gains without thinking long-term strategy, and that's a real trap.
Mm-hmm. So with this, Putin has echoed Trump's claim that the conflict in Ukraine could have been avoided if Trump had remained in office. Professor Bond, do you agree with this assessment? And what could have been different in U.S. Russia ties during Trump's first term that may have prevented the current crisis?
To be honest with you, I don't agree with that argument because Putin's war has a long history and has been made under a big picture, which has nothing to do with a specific event or a characteristic of American leadership. When Putin seized political power in 2000, his ambitious objective was to return Russia to the status of the Soviet Union. In short, he wanted the revival of Russia. To that end, he has adopted a grand geopolitical strategy developed by Alexander Dugin. Under this geopolitical strategy, in 2008, Putin went to the Second Chechen War, and then in 2014, he annexed Crimea. Likewise, in 2022, Putin invaded Ukraine. If so, why does Putin pretend to agree with Trump's claim that if he were president, the war with Ukraine could not have taken place? First, this argument is based on Putin's calculation to better deal with Trump's transactional approach. By pretending that Putin agrees with Trump and following Trump's leadership, he seeks to have a better position for maximizing gains from negotiations. Second, Putin's agreement with Trump is intended to make him get out of his diplomatic isolation from the international community by emphasizing his direct communication with Trump, a leader of a great power in the world. Putin believes that direct negotiation served as a golden momentum for him to return to a diplomatic arena officially. In short, his agreement is calculated strategically, transactionally, and diplomatically. In the meantime, if Trump were president, Putin might have paid more attention to making a transactional approach with Trump because he knows that Trump likes it. However, even if these temporal transactions might have prevented the war in 2022, war would have been unavoidable, and it could take place later in 2023 or in 2024 because of Putin's war policy based on geopolitical strategy. So what matters for war prevention is deterrent capability, not a short-sighted transaction.
Right, so the agreement was just a part of his strategy to maintain negotiations with Washington. Now, NATO Chief Mark Rutte mentioned having ideas for potential peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, but he said it's a secret. He says it will be effective in preventing Putin from trying to conquer Ukraine again. Professor, how do you think realistic is this goal, and what kind of steps do you think NATO and the West could take to ensure that this could happen?
Well, NATO Chief Rutte's argument shows how seriously NATO has been examining numerous scenarios of a potential peace. This potential peace appears to aim at preventing Russia from ever invading Ukraine again, rather than a transactional approach or an architecture of a win-win for both actors of Ukraine and Russia that makes peace feasible. In particular, I'm not sure whether it is feasible because Putin does not want any architecture that his military forces make it hard to invade Ukraine later on. Moreover, Rutte does not seem to have brought this issue or agenda to the table with Putin in the sense that he said it is a little secret. I'm not sure whether what is their idea. It could be a scenario in which, in the first step, NATO helps Ukraine improve its military forces significantly, and then in the second phase, it allows Ukraine to join NATO under the condition that Ukraine yields some of the territory occupied by Russia. If not, it could be a scenario that a European defense force is established differently from NATO forces and then is deployed in Ukraine as a deterrent force by adopting President Macron's proposal of a European defense initiative. Or, as Dr. Davis mentioned earlier, it could be related to Trump's recent transactional approach with Ukraine, that the United States can continue its military support to Ukraine under the condition that the United States signs a rare earth access agreement with Ukraine. Meanwhile, the effort itself is meaningful, but making it become real is not going to be easy because this idea makes it hard to equally persuade each of the two parties, Ukraine and Russia. To top it up, whatever that idea is, it might take a long time to be realized as an effective remedy.
Right. So as of now, we really don't know what the secret idea is, but the NATO chief said the primary focus should be supporting Ukraine with weapons and training. So Dr. Davis, how effective do you think this approach has been so far in helping Ukraine defend himself against Russia's military advances?
Look, I think when Ukraine has been given that military support that it needed, it has been quite effective. The Ukrainians have, in many respects, fought the Russians to a standstill. I think where things have gone wrong is that they launched a counteroffensive in 2020, late 2022, that failed, and then there was a lack of support, sufficient support from the West to allow them to regroup. And so now the Ukrainians are facing manpower shortages. They're facing shortages in terms of munitions and weapons capabilities. And so the Russians are making a slow, grinding advance in key areas such as the Donbass, in particular around Pokrovsk. And I think that the risk is that if that military support fades away, if we don't continue to support Ukraine, then the Russians will break through in key areas, particularly around Pokrovsk, and then make much quicker advances towards Kyiv and Kharkiv in the north, and also Odessa in the south. And I think that that would be catastrophic because the Russians could then claim much more Ukrainian territory and then say, we're ready for a ceasefire on our terms. What that does then is give the Russians time to regroup and then be ready to either launch further attacks in the near future, in a year or two, to claim more territory, or worse still, they would see NATO weakness or a lack of US support of NATO as an opportunity to make a move elsewhere against NATO. For example, you're seeing Russian hybrid warfare attacks occurring in the Baltic Seas against submarine cables. Those are different Russian attacks against NATO here in the grey zone. Those could easily become more traditional kinetic attacks in areas such as the Baltic states. So the real risk here is that if we don't get this right, we actually lay the groundwork for a much wider war in a year or two that emerges out of Ukraine and spreads into Europe itself. And that's why I think you see Mark Rutte, Macron, and others in Europe starting to take this very seriously and starting to think, actually, Europe does need to stand on its own because we can't count on the US under Trump.
Now, let's also touch upon North Korean involvement. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky recently warned that North Korea could send additional troops, probably 20,000 to 25,000, to Russia. How do you see the changes and how significant is this development, Professor Bond?
Well, I do believe that the additional deployment of North Korean troops is highly likely because Kim Jong-un and Putin are satisfied with this strategic deal. Kim Jong-un makes money from this strategic deal, and furthermore, he believes that North Korea can be a recognized nuclear power under the strong support of Russia thanks to this strategic deal. Putin can expect more forces and more ammunition, which is needed not only to win the war, but also to step up his leverage over the United States and Ukraine in the possible peace talks. What is interesting is that the additional deployment of North Korean troops has an impact on not only the direction of peace talks on the Russia-Ukraine war, but also the direction of a potential Trump-Kim Jong-un summit. Furthermore, I would say that the additional deployment of North Korean troops will bolster the mechanism of geopolitical convergence that security on the Eurasian geopolitical region cannot be separated from security on the Korean Peninsula. It means that Russia has turned into serious military threat to South Korea, and geopolitical risks are vital to the world. In short, the additional deployment of North Korean troops has a ripple effect on security on the Korean Peninsula, regional security, and even international security.
Right, so this deepening ties between the two countries are really concerning at this point. What about Dr. Davis? How do you view Russia's increasing ties with North Korea, with North Korea's recent military support for Russia? What kind of impact could this have on Russia's military capabilities and also its position on the global stage?
Well, look, I think at the grand strategic level, you need to see the situation, the war in Ukraine, and now with North Korean forces joining the fight alongside Russia as part of a wider contest between an axis of authoritarian states, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, that are working together to confront and overturn the international order that is based on the governance of liberal democratic systems. So this needs to be seen as a global contest, a global confrontation between authoritarianism on the one hand and liberal democracy on the other. And the North Korean decision to support Russia initially with weapons and now directly with troops is part of that global contest, that global confrontation. And so I think that what you will see is the North Koreans continuing to provide weapons and personnel, additional army forces to go into the fight in Ukraine. In return, the North Koreans are getting all sorts of access to technologies related to their nuclear weapons program, in particular as a relation to tactical nuclear weapons, missile delivery systems, and also space launch capabilities. So there's a real quid pro quo there that Pyongyang and Moscow are working together. China is watching this with some concern because ultimately it's China that wants to manage the relationship with Pyongyang. It doesn't want Moscow to have the dominant hand there. But this is, I think, part of a broader contest, a broader confrontation between authoritarianism and liberal democracy on the other hand that is just getting started and that could last many, many years.
Right. So Dr. Davis just touched upon the influence of this collaboration between the two countries. But with reported losses of North Korean troops in Russia and the fact that they're also gaining modern warfare experience, Professor Bond, how might this experience influence the future military capabilities of North Korea, especially if they return to their home country?
Well, battlefield experience itself, simply beyond a modern warfare experience, really matters to how to fight better. And when soldiers believe that they fight well, a political leader is better positioned to use military forces for achieving his political objectives. Under the logic of this mechanism, modern warfare experience makes Kim Jong-un's miscalculation more likely in terms of the Second Korean War ambition. As a matter of fact, although North Korea has developed many weapons, both conventional and nuclear, and made numerous provocations, its troops have not had any war experience since the Korean War until its war against Ukraine. Likewise, North Korea has stick to a traditional war strategy based upon massive amount of ground troops, which is far away from modern warfare. Meanwhile, the deployment of North Korean soldiers on the battlefield makes this posture be changed significantly. So what happens if North Korean troops return to their home country? Now the North Korean forces have had a real battlefield experience and have learned the modern warfare like drone warfare. I believe that North Korea will rush to seriously develop a new military strategy that incorporates modern warfare for the Korean Peninsula theater. What does that mean? It means that North Korea is equipped with an effective strategy as well as massive conventional forces and nuclear weapons. On the contrary, South Korean troops have not had war experience after the Vietnam War and are not armed with nuclear weapons. This disparity makes military and strategic balance unfunctional so that it ends up being militarily disadvantageous to South Korea and advantageous to North Korea. In the sense, South Korean troops should pay tremendous attention to bolstering military readiness by offsetting this imbalance so that deterrence will be able to be continued.
Right. So with this ongoing cooperation between the two countries, South Korea must gear up for any possibilities. Now, I'm afraid we'll have to leave our discussion right here. We're running out of time. But thank you so much for your insights tonight, Professor Ban and Dr. Davis. We appreciate it so much.
Thanks for having me.
That'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.